Jack Allen Morrison crouched beside the foundation stakes, his weathered hands tracing the perimeter of what would become his winter shelter. The September wind carried the scent of approaching snow from the Black Hills, and the 67-year-old rancher could feel the weight of another harsh South Dakota winter settling into his bones. Behind him, the voices of the county building inspectors grew louder, their laughter cutting through the crisp autumn air like barbed wire. The younger inspector, clipboard in hand, shook his head as he examined Morrison's foundation plans. His partner gestured dismissively at the hand-drawn sketches, comparing them unfavorably to the computer-generated blueprints of the modern cabin developments sprouting across Rapid City's expanding suburbs. Morrison's proposed structure appeared primitive by their standards, low-slung, partially underground, with thick earthen berms and a peculiar drainage system that seemed to defy conventional engineering wisdom. Morrison had submitted his building application 3 times, each rejection stamped with the same bureaucratic language about code violations and structural inadequacy. The inspectors questioned his use of traditional materials, his unconventional foundation depth, and his insistence on building techniques that predated modern construction standards by decades. They dismissed his explanations about wind resistance and thermal efficiency, treating his decades of ranching experience as irrelevant folklore in the face of contemporary building science. The old cowboy's isolation had deepened over the years as Rapid City transformed around him. His ranch, once part of a thriving community of independent cattlemen, now sat surrounded by suburban developments, with names like Prairie Vista and Black Hills Meadows. The new residents viewed Morrison as an anachronism, a stubborn relic refusing to embrace progress. They complained about his cattle wandering near their property lines and petitioned the city council to enforce stricter building codes that would force older residents to modernize or relocate. Morrison's neighbors had embraced the latest in home construction technology. Their houses featured state-of-the-art insulation, modern HVAC systems, and foundations engineered according to the most current seismic and weather-resistant standards. They pointed to their energy efficiency ratings and structural warranties as evidence of their superiority over Morrison's antiquated approach. When he attempted to explain the principles behind his planned construction, they responded with polite condescension, treating him like a well-meaning but misguided old man clinging to outdated traditions. The building department's final rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September. Morrison read the document twice, noting the familiar language about safety concerns and the inspector's recommendation that he hire a licensed architect to develop plans that met contemporary standards. The letter concluded with a stern warning about the legal consequences of proceeding without proper permits. Morrison folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, then walked to the wooden box beneath his bedroom window, where he kept his most precious possessions. Among the items inside was a small leather pouch containing a piece of carved bone and a faded photograph of himself as a young man standing beside a Native American tracker named Thomas Running Bear. The photograph had been taken in 1968, deep in the Badlands, during the worst blizzard Morrison had ever encountered. Running Bear had found Morrison half-frozen beside his disabled truck, barely conscious and suffering from severe hypothermia. The tracker had built an emergency shelter using techniques passed down through generations of Lakota survivors, creating a structure that not only protected them from the deadly storm, but actually became warmer as the blizzard intensified. During the 3 days they waited for the weather to clear, Running Bear had shared the principles behind his construction methods, explaining how the earth itself could be transformed into the most effective insulation and how proper positioning could turn wind from an enemy into an ally. The tracker had taught Morrison to read the subtle signs in the landscape that indicated optimal building sites, showing him how to identify natural wind patterns and drainage flows that modern surveying equipment often missed. Running Bear explained that his people had survived on these plains for centuries by working with the forces of nature rather than attempting to dominate them. He demonstrated how to create thermal mass that would store and redistribute heat, how to design ventilation systems that prevented moisture buildup without sacrificing warmth, and how to construct foundations that would remain stable through the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed conventional structures. Morrison had spent the following decades applying these lessons to his ranching operation, building barns and equipment shelters that outlasted newer structures on neighboring properties. His cattle wintered better than those kept in modern facilities, and his buildings required minimal maintenance despite their age. When other ranchers experienced structural failures during severe weather events, Morrison's traditional construction techniques proved their worth through quiet endurance. But the world had changed since 1968, and the knowledge that had once saved Morrison's life was now dismissed as primitive superstition by officials who measured competence through compliance with standardized codes. The old cowboy faced a choice between abandoning the wisdom that had served him for over 3 decades or proceeding without official approval and risking legal consequences. Morrison spent the following week walking his property, studying the natural features that Running Bear had taught him to recognize. The slight depression where cold air would settle during winter nights, the rocky outcropping that would deflect the worst of the north wind, the barely perceptible slope that would ensure proper drainage during spring snowmelt. His trained eye could see what the government surveyors had missed, reading the land like a familiar book whose pages revealed secrets invisible to casual observers. On the first Monday of October, Morrison began construction. He worked alone, using hand tools and techniques that predated power equipment by generations. The foundation went deeper than county requirements specified, extending below the frost line to bedrock, then expanding into a series of chambers that would create natural air circulation. He positioned massive stones according to principles Running Bear had demonstrated, creating thermal mass that would moderate temperature extremes throughout the winter months. The earthen berms rose gradually, each layer compacted according to specific moisture content and density requirements that existed in no official manual. Morrison mixed clay and sand in proportions determined by feel rather than measurement, creating a seal that would repel water while allowing the structure to breathe. He oriented the entrance to capture southern exposure while protecting against northern storms, following star patterns that Running Bear had used to navigate the endless prairie nights. As October progressed, the first major storm system of the season began building over the Rocky Mountains. Weather services tracked its eastward movement, predicting heavy snow and high winds for the northern plains. Morrison continued his work with methodical patience, ignoring the county citations that arrived with increasing frequency. The legal papers accumulated on his kitchen table, threatening fines and court appearances, but the old cowboy remained focused on completion deadlines imposed by approaching winter rather than arbitrary government schedules. His suburban neighbors watched his construction progress with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. They had invested heavily in modern heating systems and professionally installed insulation, confident that contemporary technology would protect them from whatever weather the season might deliver. Their houses featured backup generators and smart thermostats, electronic systems designed to maintain comfort regardless of external conditions. They viewed Morrison's manual construction methods as quaint at best, dangerously inadequate at worst. The storm arrived during the 3rd week of October, earlier and more intense than meteorologists had predicted. What began as a typical autumn snowfall rapidly developed into a full-scale blizzard, with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and temperatures dropping below zero. The power grid, stressed by sudden demand for emergency heating, began failing across Rapid City's newer developments. Morrison had completed his shelter just days before the storm hit. The structure appeared unremarkable from the outside, resembling a natural hill more than a human dwelling. But as the wind howled across the prairie and snow accumulated in towering drifts, the old cowboy remained warm and comfortable inside his earth-sheltered home. The thermal mass absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually through the night, maintaining stable temperatures without any external energy source. The storm continued for 4 days, breaking records for both duration and intensity. Across the city, modern homes struggled against the assault of wind and cold. Heating systems failed as power outages spread, and poorly insulated foundations allowed frost to penetrate deep into living spaces. Emergency shelters opened in schools and community centers as residents evacuated homes that had become uninhabitable, despite their contemporary construction and expensive heating equipment. Morrison's neighbors, huddled in their powerless houses beneath layers of blankets, watched in disbelief as smoke rose steadily from the old cowboy's chimney. His shelter not only survived the storm, but seemed to function better as conditions worsened. The wind that threatened to tear apart conventional structures actually enhanced his building's performance, driving air through carefully designed passages that improved heating efficiency and prevented dangerous carbon monoxide buildup. When the storm finally passed, the damage assessment revealed a clear pattern. The newest houses, built to the most current standards and equipped with the latest technology, had suffered the most severe problems. Frozen pipes burst in subdivisions where heating systems had failed, and structural damage occurred where conventional foundations had been undermined by frost penetration. Insurance adjusters worked overtime processing claims from residents whose modern homes had proven vulnerable to conditions their grandparents would have considered merely inconvenient. Morrison emerged from his shelter on the 5th morning to find county inspectors waiting in his driveway. The same officials who had rejected his building plans stood silently in the aftermath of the storm, surrounded by evidence that challenged their professional assumptions. The old cowboy's structure had not only survived the severe weather, but had provided superior protection compared to the approved buildings that now required extensive repairs. The lead inspector examined Morrison's construction with newfound respect, noting details that had seemed primitive during his earlier visits. The earthen construction had eliminated thermal bridging that plagued modern insulated walls. The natural ventilation system had prevented the moisture problems that were causing mold growth in tightly sealed contemporary homes. The deep foundation had remained stable, while newer structures showed signs of frost damage and settling. Morrison offered no explanations or justifications for his methods. He simply invited the inspectors inside, where they experienced the remarkable comfort and stability that Running Bear's techniques had created. The interior temperature had remained constant throughout the storm, and the air quality was superior to that found in mechanically ventilated modern buildings. The shelter's performance spoke for itself, requiring no verbal defense or technical documentation. Word of Morrison's success spread quietly through the community as residents compared their storm experiences. The suburban neighbors who had once criticized his primitive methods began asking careful questions about his construction techniques. They observed that his utility bills remained minimal, while their own heating costs had skyrocketed following the storm damage. Some approached him with requests for advice about retrofitting their homes to incorporate elements of his traditional design. The county eventually dropped its legal actions against Morrison, quietly approving his construction after the fact. The building department began studying his techniques, interviewing the old cowboy about the principles behind his successful design. Morrison shared what he could remember of Running Bear's teachings, but he emphasized that the knowledge belonged to a tradition that extended far beyond any individual practitioner. Winter settled fully over South Dakota in the weeks following the October storm. bringing additional tests of Morrison's shelter. Each blizzard that swept across the prairie only confirmed the wisdom embedded in his construction methods. While his neighbors struggled with heating bills and maintenance issues, the old cowboy lived comfortably in his earth-sheltered home, warm and dry, regardless of external conditions. The transformation in community attitudes occurred gradually, without fanfare or acknowledgement. Residents who had once viewed Morrison as an obstacle to progress began recognizing him as a keeper of valuable knowledge. The building inspectors who had initially dismissed his plans started consulting him about traditional construction techniques. Architects arrived from regional firms, requesting information about thermal mass design and natural ventilation systems. Morrison remained characteristically quiet about his vindication, showing no satisfaction at having proven his critics wrong. He continued his daily routines, caring for his remaining cattle and maintaining his property with the same methodical patience that had guided his construction project. The old cowboy understood that his success represented something larger than personal validation. It demonstrated the enduring value of indigenous knowledge that mainstream society had nearly forgotten. The land around his shelter showed the wisdom of Running Bear's site selection as winter progressed. Snow accumulated in patterns that provided additional insulation rather than creating structural stress. Wind flow around the building remained laminar, preventing the turbulence that caused ice dams and heat loss in conventional structures. The natural drainage system channeled snowmelt away from the foundation, preventing the moisture problems that plagued nearby developments. As February approached, bringing the season's most severe weather, Morrison's shelter continued functioning with quiet efficiency. The thermal mass had stabilized at optimal temperature, requiring minimal external heating despite outdoor temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees. The old cowboy lived through the worst of winter with comfort that exceeded what his wealthy neighbors achieved despite their expensive heating systems and modern technology. The county building department formally requested that Morrison document his construction methods for inclusion in updated building codes. Engineers studied his foundation design, attempting to understand how traditional techniques had outperformed contemporary standards. Environmental scientists measured his structure's energy efficiency, finding performance levels that surpassed certified green building designs. Morrison cooperated with the investigations while maintaining his characteristic reserve. He demonstrated techniques when asked, but he insisted that the knowledge belonged to Running Bear's people and should be credited accordingly. The old cowboy refused payment for his consultations, treating the sharing of traditional wisdom as an obligation rather than a commercial opportunity. Spring arrived early that year, bringing rapid snowmelt that tested drainage systems throughout the region. Morrison's shelter handled the flooding conditions without difficulty, while several modern homes in the area suffered foundation damage from water infiltration. The earthen construction proved its superiority once again, managing moisture naturally through materials and techniques that required no mechanical intervention or maintenance. The building inspector, who had initially rejected Morrison's plans, visited one final time as the construction season began. He walked the property with the old cowboy, studying details of the traditional design with professional curiosity and personal humility. Morrison pointed out features that had seemed crude during the original inspection, but had proven essential to the structure's performance during the winter's extreme conditions. The inspector inquired about Running Bear, asking whether the tracker might be available for consultation on future projects. Morrison replied that his teacher had passed away many years earlier, taking with him knowledge that could never be fully replaced. The old cowboy emphasized that his own understanding remained incomplete, a pale reflection of the wisdom that indigenous people had developed over countless generations of surviving on the harsh prairie. As summer approached and construction activity resumed throughout Rapid City, Morrison's influence became apparent in new building designs. Architects incorporated thermal mass principles into their plans. Contractors adopted foundation techniques that extended below the frost line. Developers began considering natural ventilation systems and earth-sheltered designs for their most challenging sites. Morrison watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, knowing that Running Bear's teachings would survive through another generation. The old cowboy had fulfilled his obligation to the tracker who had saved his life, ensuring that traditional knowledge would continue serving those wise enough to recognize its value. The shelter that officials had once called primitive had become a model for sustainable construction, proving that indigenous wisdom remained relevant in the modern world. The old cowboy understood that his role as teacher was temporary, that the knowledge he shared belonged to a tradition that extended far into the past and would continue long after his own time had ended. He had merely served as a bridge between Running Bear's generation and the contemporary community that was finally ready to listen. The land itself would be the ultimate judge of which building methods deserved to survive, and Morrison was confident that traditional techniques would continue proving their worth through every storm that crossed the Great Plains. During the following months, Morrison received visitors from universities and research institutions, scholars seeking to document indigenous construction techniques before they disappeared completely. The old cowboy welcomed these researchers with the same quiet courtesy he showed to his neighbors, but he insisted that their studies acknowledge the true source of the wisdom they were investigating. He shared stories about Running Bear that he had never told before, describing the tracker's deep understanding of natural forces and his ability to work with environmental conditions rather than fighting against them. The academic visitors took careful measurements of Morrison's shelter, creating detailed drawings and conducting thermal imaging studies that revealed the sophisticated engineering principles embedded in seemingly simple construction choices. They discovered that Running Bear's techniques incorporated advanced concepts about heat transfer, moisture management, and structural dynamics that contemporary engineering schools were just beginning to explore. The traditional methods achieved performance levels that modern technology struggled to match, using only materials available from the local environment. Morrison found himself becoming an unexpected spokesperson for sustainable building practices, invited to speak at conferences and consulted by government agencies, developing new construction standards. He accepted these responsibilities reluctantly, understanding that his words carried the weight of tradition, but feeling inadequate to represent knowledge that belonged to Running Bear's people. The old cowboy spoke simply about practical matters, describing techniques in terms of their observable effects rather than attempting to explain the deeper principles that guided their application. The shelter continued serving as a living demonstration of traditional wisdom throughout the second winter after its completion. Morrison documented its performance carefully, recording temperatures and humidity levels at the request of the researchers who visited regularly. The data confirmed what experience had already proven, that Running Bear's techniques created optimal living conditions with minimal environmental impact and virtually no dependence on external energy sources. As word of Morrison's success spread beyond South Dakota, builders and architects arrived from distant cities to study his construction methods. They brought sophisticated measuring equipment and computer modeling software, attempting to quantify the performance advantages of traditional techniques. Morrison cooperated with their investigations while maintaining his insistence that the knowledge belonged to indigenous traditions that deserved proper recognition and respect. The old cowboy's property became an informal educational center, with visitors arriving weekly to learn about earth-sheltered construction and natural building materials. Morrison established simple guidelines for these visits, requiring that participants acknowledge the source of the techniques they were learning and commit to sharing the knowledge freely rather than commercializing it. He insisted that traditional wisdom belonged to all people and should not be restricted by patents or proprietary claims. The county building department incorporated elements of Morrison's design into their updated construction codes, creating new categories for traditional building techniques that had previously been excluded from official approval. The changes reflected growing recognition that indigenous knowledge systems contained solutions to contemporary environmental challenges. Modern building science was finally catching up with principles that native peoples had understood for centuries. Morrison's influence extended beyond construction techniques as neighboring ranches began adopting traditional land management practices that the old cowboy had learned from Running Bear. Methods for reading weather patterns, understanding soil conditions, and predicting seasonal changes proved as valuable as building techniques in the harsh environment of the northern plains. The tracker's wisdom had encompassed a complete approach to living sustainably in a challenging landscape. The old cowboy continued his quiet routine throughout the changing seasons, caring for his cattle and maintaining his property with the methodical patience that had always characterized his work. His shelter required minimal maintenance despite the extreme weather conditions it had weathered, proving the durability of traditional construction methods. Morrison noted these details in the journals he kept for the researchers, documenting performance data that would support future applications of indigenous techniques. The transformation of community attitudes accelerated as Morrison's neighbors experienced multiple severe weather events that tested their own building choices. Each storm provided additional evidence that traditional methods offered superior protection and comfort compared to conventional construction. Residents who had once dismissed the old cowboy's approach began retrofitting their homes with earth berms and thermal mass features inspired by his successful design. The building inspector, who had initially rejected Morrison's plans, visited regularly during his final year of service, bringing new employees to see the shelter that had changed his understanding of effective construction. He used Morrison's structure as a teaching tool, explaining how traditional techniques achieved superior performance through principles that formal engineering education had overlooked. The inspector's conversion from skeptic to advocate represented the broader shift occurring throughout the building industry. Morrison understood that his most important contribution was not the shelter itself, but the precedent it established for respecting indigenous knowledge in contemporary applications. The old cowboy had proven that traditional techniques deserved serious consideration rather than dismissive rejection. His quiet persistence had opened doors for future builders who chose to learn from native peoples rather than ignoring their accumulated wisdom. The cattle that wintered in structures built using Running Bear's principles consistently outperformed herds housed in modern facilities, providing additional evidence of traditional wisdom's practical value. Morrison's livestock required less supplemental feeding and experienced fewer health problems during severe weather, demonstrating that indigenous techniques benefited animals as well as humans. The old cowboy documented these results carefully, adding agricultural data to the growing body of evidence supporting traditional construction methods. As Morrison aged, he began training selected visitors in the practical skills needed to implement traditional building techniques. He taught them to read landscape features that indicated optimal building sites, to select and prepare natural materials according to seasonal conditions, and to construct thermal mass systems that would function reliably through decades of use. These students became carriers of Running Bear's wisdom, ensuring its survival into future generations. The old cowboy's final years were spent quietly on his property, watching the shelter that had vindicated his faith in traditional knowledge continue functioning with remarkable efficiency. Each season brought new visitors seeking to learn from his experience, and Morrison shared what he could, while emphasizing that his understanding remained incomplete compared to Running Bear's profound knowledge of natural principles. The shelter stood as a permanent monument to indigenous wisdom, proving that traditional techniques offered solutions to contemporary challenges. Morrison had successfully bridged the gap between Running Bear's generation and the modern world, ensuring that valuable knowledge would survive and continue serving those wise enough to recognize its worth. The old cowboy's legacy lay not in personal achievement, but in his role as custodian of wisdom that belonged to all humanity.